All right, I'd now like to welcome on a very special guest. It is really the recurring hockey guy and Penn State guy of this podcast. It seems to be when you come on. It is Nick Zararis. Nick, what's going on?
Nothing much. I'm excited. This is the first. This feels like the second big game of the year in terms of just on paper. Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon, Washington. This past weekend was the first one because that had real CFP implications. Where more than likely, whoever won that game was going to be in the pole position to win their conference. This is the first one for the Big Ten to kind of start sorting out who's going to finish where. This is why we play the games.
Yeah, I would say Oregon, Washington, this game, and because it was early, it didn't have as much hype, but I think Alabama, Texas was that other game because that basically allowed Texas to lose that game to Oklahoma in the regular season and still have a path if they win the Big 12 and win the rematch against Oklahoma. And then Alabama has now been in a position where they can't lose if they want to make the playoffs. So I think those have been this is now the third game that I've been like, this game is like everything's kind of on the line for these teams. And especially with how good Michigan's been playing, it's like you're going to have to, one of these teams is going to have to get through Michigan to get to the Big Ten championship game. And so this is really going to tell us which one of these two teams is the team that can go to Michigan, because currently, as it stands, Michigan looks like kind of to be like a head above these two teams. But that being said, Michigan has basically played nobody. Penn State has basically played nobody, which makes this kind of interesting. Ohio State played Notre Dame, who Notre Dame has also lost some bad games. They should have lost to Duke. Notre Dame, I don't think is all that, and Notre Dame really should have won that game against Ohio State. They kind of blew it. So I think both of these teams, we still are not entirely sure who they are, and hopefully we're going to find out this week. But before we get into all the big games, we are right at the halfway point of the season through 7 weeks. So I just wanted to do a quick like mid-season awards and kind of assess where we are halfway through the season, who's still kind of in contention, who we see kind of surviving this second half of the season and making it to the playoffs. So starting with the Heisman, if you had to give it out right now, this would have been a much more interesting conversation last week, probably. You had, I think, Michael Penix and Caleb Williams were basically tied for favorite. Bo Nix was right behind. It was like, oh, whoever can kind of survive this Pac-12 is probably going to be the favorite. And then you have Michael Penix go win that game. Caleb Williams had the worst game of his career, probably, against Notre Dame. And all of a sudden, Michael Penix is by far the favorite. So I'm assuming that's who you have down as your Heisman.
I'll just give you a stat about Michael Penix. He's had more 300-yard passing games than any Washington quarterback in the last 6 years, just this year. Total. In 6 years, he has more 300-yard passing ones than the last 6 years. He's been that good. 100%. That the only real argument would have been if Oregon won that game, but with Penix winning, no, there's not really an argument.
Yeah, I think they're now even on the look ahead line a small favorite going to USC. But Caleb Williams, even if you look at the odds board, he basically disappeared. That game against Notre Dame has basically taken him out of contention. And I've said this even before last week. I think Oregon and Washington are both going to beat USC. I think they're both a level above USC. Their defenses are better and their offenses are like, I think they're both just better teams than USC. So Caleb Williams has dropped way down. Really, if you look at people that could challenge Michael Penix, there's five guys behind him before there's a pretty big drop off in the odds, and that's Dylan Gabriel at Oklahoma, JJ McCarthy, Jaden Daniels, Jordan Travis, Drake May. Those are the five guys before there's a pretty big drop off, which is basically saying at this point, to win the Heisman, you probably need to be a quarterback. Brock Bowers was making it somewhat interesting, but now with his injury, he's going to be out. And what we've seen the last few years is you kind of need to go to the playoff, which means you probably need to win your conference, which is why I would throw Jaden Daniels out if you were trying to grab one of those other guys. His stats are ridiculous. His numbers are maybe going to be the best of anybody besides Penix, or even as good as Penix by the end of the year. Jaden Daniels does have a chance at like a Heisman moment. He still is going to play Alabama this year, and if they could somehow pull off that upset, maybe. But with 2 losses, I just don't think they're making the playoffs. So I would throw him out. Jordan Travis, his numbers just aren't there. If you look at his passing yards, passing touchdowns compared to Penix, Jaden Daniels, Dylan Gabriel, even Drake May, like his numbers just aren't there. And then same with Drake May. One, I just don't think they're going to win their conference and go undefeated the rest of the way. So really, if you're going to take a shot on somebody, I think it would actually be JJ McCarthy. I think there's a chance if Michigan, he has big chances for Heisman moments again, still playing Penn State, still playing Ohio State. If he can like be the guy in those games, because in the last couple of years in those Ohio State games, it's been run the ball down their throats, dominate them physically. If he can kind of be more of like an air it out type of guy in those games where he puts up huge numbers, say other people lose a game here and there, and they're the number 1 team in the country, the clear number 1 going into the playoff, I think he's the only guy that could catch Penix.
I think the more interesting conversation at this point is who other than Penix gets invited to the ceremony in New York, because that's frankly the only real contention is how the votes are going to shake out. I think there's a world where Jordan Travis, because Florida State's kind of in a good position to make the playoff, he probably has a path to that. If Jaden Daniels and LSU can beat Alabama in a couple of weeks, then they're in that conversation. There's a world where they play Georgia really well in the SEC title game, and everybody kind of feels good about that based off of that. But yeah, it has to be Penix, and then the order the rest of them shake out in, it's really just a matter of preference. Something kind of dramatic would have to happen. McCarthy is feasible. McCarthy is the only one that has, I feel, a legitimate chance of winning, and that's only based on what they still have on their schedule, because he's yet to really have any insane games because they haven't played anybody and he hasn't needed to. That's kind of been the story of the entire Big Ten, which I'm sure we're going to get to when we start talking about the Penn State game, is other than Ohio State, nobody's really played anybody. And even Ohio State hasn't played that well in those games against the better opponents.
Yeah. And as somebody with the Penix 14-1 ticket, he's been my guy for a year and a half now. Like it's great to see where the odds are at, but still got half the season to go. He's still got to play USC, still got some tough games. Still always there's a chance a guy gets injured, like we just saw with Brock Bowers, and then all of a sudden you're out. So you never know until they're there in New York. But if he's healthy and makes it through the rest of the season, it's hard to imagine somebody else winning. So next we're just going to look at surprise team and disappointing team of the season so far. I'm going to let you go first because I have 2 in case we had the same one. I'll have a backup option. So who's been your surprise team so far?
Oklahoma. I'm just not used to Oklahoma having a functioning defense. They are a smash mouth, almost I would say Big Ten West style of defense, where they out physical Texas in that game, and that, in my opinion, was one of the deciding factors. And the offense hasn't been bad in spite of the fact they have a good defense. They've been pretty balanced, and they have a good shot. I mean, they're going to have to beat Texas again in a few weeks when they play in the Big 12 title game, assuming that's what the Big 12 title game is. But Oklahoma's got a real playoff chance here if everything shakes out for them.
Yeah, I had a feeling that's who you were going to pick because I wrote down Oklahoma and then one other team because I think most people would say they have been, after last year was such a disappointing year one. And in year one for Venables, it was like, oh, is he the guy? Is he more of just a coordinator? And yeah, their defense is much improved. Dylan Gabriel, like we were just talking about in the Heisman race, like he's one of those guys that's up there for a reason because this team has a pretty clear path. I mean, I think UCF, John Reese Plumlee is supposed to be back for UCF this week. I actually think that's a tough spot for them. But at home, they should still be able to win the game. And then, I mean, they're going to Kansas, going to Oklahoma State, hosting TCU to end the season. Like those aren't gimme games by any means, but they should be favorites in every game they play the rest of the regular season. If they can just kind of stay focused and take care of business, they should be 12-0, and Texas should be 11-1 going into that Big 12 championship game. And depending on where the rest of the country is at, it's very possible the winner of that game gets into the college football playoff. an undefeated Oklahoma would definitely get into the playoff. But I think Texas, if they avenge their only loss and they have that win against Alabama, I think that gets them into the playoff at 12-1 as Big 12 conference champions. So that'd be awesome to see that rematch because I agree. Oklahoma's been awesome. And the other team I wrote down is North Carolina.
Yeah.
They're a team, obviously, there was this hype around Drake May. There has been for a couple of years now, but that he is probably the number 2 quarterback in this draft behind Caleb Williams. And I mean, some people have had their doubts and still have their doubts about him. He has basically all the attributes you could want in an NFL style quarterback, but doesn't mean it always is going to pay off. But I think the thing that's been really impressive about them has been their defense. Again, same thing we said about Oklahoma. It was like, yeah, Drake May's probably going to go out and put up 30 every week, which he has. They've not scored less than 31 points in a game so far this season. Like their offense is hitting, but the defense has been better. I mean, they've played some tougher opponents, but week 1 against South Carolina, it was a close game, kind of halfway through, and then they turned on the gas late. The defense was much better in the second half, and they ran away. And that's the same thing we saw against Miami last week. Miami was kind of hanging in there, and then North Carolina came out in the second half and just kind of laid it on them. And they're another team where you look at their schedule, they have 3 easy wins the next 3 weeks: Virginia, Georgia Tech, and then Campbell. And it does end tougher, but they get Duke at home, which is huge. They have to go to Clemson, but Clemson is not Clemson anymore. It's still a tough place to go play and get a win, but we saw Florida State do it earlier this year. It's definitely doable. And NC State, who has had a kind of a disappointing year. So there is a path where we also have an undefeated UNC against an undefeated Florida State in the ACC championship game, which is where things could get really crazy, talking about who could get into the playoff. Because if you're saying the winner of Oklahoma, Texas gets in and the winner of UNC, Florida State gets in, then that means somebody somewhere is getting left out. This is the first time that there's not a clear conference that you're like, we're probably not going to get a team from that conference. It's really going to depend on who can stay undefeated, not take a bad loss. So I've been really impressed with North Carolina, and I think they have a path to get to that ACC championship game. And I'm still lower on Florida State than a lot of people are. I'm still not totally sold on their defense, and I think there's a chance UNC could win out the rest of the way.
That will be this is the most, I want to say, compressed it's been. I think this is the closest gaps wise in terms of talent we've seen from teams that can legitimately make the playoff in quite a while. Like Georgia, the last 2 teams has fielded like NFL teams. Michigan is very good. They don't have that type of talent gap to like 6 or 7 like Georgia's had the last couple of years. There's a world where like all of these teams have 1 loss going into the playoff, and it's whichever loss is the least bad. Or there's a world where we have 5 undefeated teams and we have to choose, okay, who's got the most impressive undefeated schedule, versus where that really hasn't been the case the last couple of years. It's kind of always been deliberating whoever the 4th or 5th is. If it's 2 losses versus 1 loss, well, who's the second loss to? Those kinds of the splitting of hairs that kind of make this more than just football, where it becomes a conversation, and what lends itself to such good conversation, frankly, because it really tells you what people prioritize in choosing who they put in that last spot.
Yeah, the next thing we're going to talk about is who we think the 4 playoff teams will be at the end of the year. Not if the playoffs started now. That's a completely different conversation, but who will be there at the end of the year. And there is a crazy scenario where you have an undefeated Georgia, an undefeated Michigan, an undefeated Florida State or North Carolina, and you have an undefeated Oklahoma, and you have an undefeated Washington. And it's like, oh, you have 5 undefeated champions, like Power 5 champions. Who gets left out? I think it would be probably Florida State or North Carolina. Probably the ACC is the weakest of the 5 conferences, if you just had to say. But Florida State also has that win over LSU. That would help in that conversation. So it really could get nuts. And it could also be, yeah, like a 1-loss Texas who avenged their only loss and has a win over Alabama, or a 1-loss Washington if they end up dropping 1 game in the regular season and still win the conference championship. It could be crazy. But I'll go ahead with my 4. Despite all this, I think Georgia holds on and wins the SEC. I just think their schedule the rest of the regular season is too easy. I think on Florida's been playing better than I thought they would. Their offense is Graham Mertz has looked better than I thought he would in that offense, but I still think Georgia will just be too much on defense in that game. And Carson Beck is really starting to play better. Honestly, he's starting to look more like the guy Georgia fans were hoping for. First few weeks, he was kind of on a leash, and they weren't really letting him do much. And since they've kind of given him more opportunity, and I think he'll only get more opportunity with Brock Bowers out, honestly, because it kind of takes away his safety net, where they're kind of going to have to trust him to make more downfield throws, look at the receivers more on deeper routes. So I think they're going to hang on. I think they're still a step above, assuming Alabama is going to be the team in the SEC championship. I think they're still a step above Alabama. And then I'm going with Michigan. I think there's no way Ohio State beats Michigan. I think Michigan is much better than them in the way that they've kind of owned them the last couple of years. I don't think this is the year that would change. I honestly do think we'll get to this in the Penn State Ohio State game, but I do think Penn State at home that has a much better chance of beating Michigan than Ohio State does. So if somebody was to upset that whole thing, I think it would actually be Penn State. But I think the way Michigan's looked, I have to go with them right now. And then I am going with Washington as my number three. I do think they make it through the rest of the Pac-12. And then my fourth team is Texas. I think they make it through the rest of the season, regular season, without a loss. And I think we do get that great rematch with Oklahoma. That is basically going to just be a play-in game for that fourth spot. And I think Texas will win the rematch. And I think that win over Alabama is going to be huge. I think if it comes down to them being a one-loss conference champion, being compared to another one-loss conference champion like in the ACC, I think that win against Alabama is going to be the thing that pushes them ahead. Obviously, that means I'm leaving out the ACC, which basically I think if there's a scenario where Florida State or North Carolina looks like one of them is going to win the conference, if one of them has the same amount of losses as anybody else, they're the worst of the Power Five conferences this year. And I just think those are just the two teams I trust the least out of there, that one of them could drop a weird game somewhere in the rest of this regular season. Maybe the team that makes it undefeated loses to the other team in the conference championship and then messes everything up. So Georgia, Michigan, Washington, Texas are my four.
So I wrote Texas originally as my four. I deleted it. I wrote Oklahoma. And then I deleted that and I wrote Florida State. I have Michigan, Georgia, Washington, and I have Florida State as the fourth one, just because I feel like that Florida State's path is the simplest. All they have to do is beat North Carolina. And then if they play Clemson again in the rematch, whatever, in the ACC title game, whatever, you're fine with. I feel pretty good about that versus I think Texas, Oklahoma is going to be, a coin flip kind of game where it's going to come down to whoever has the ball last, least kinds of least fewest mistakes in a game kind of situation that those games have come down to for the most part. For the most part, that game is typically pretty close. And we've seen some pretty chaotic Big 12 title games the last couple of years, games that have come down to a ball on the goal line and guys getting tackled a foot short of the goal line to win the game. I just think it is the least chaotic, least variant version of the path forward for Florida State. All they got to do is take care of their UNC game, and then they'll be more than likely favored in the ACC title game. Versus, I like Texas. I think this is the best iteration of Texas we've seen in quite a long time. Their defense, in particular, the pass rush is really, really good. But what Oklahoma was able to do, they made Ewers make some decisions, some really bad decisions by pressuring him a lot, speeding up his clock. I like Florida State just a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the problem is if I picked Texas at 4, but that's really counting on a loss from Florida State because Florida State completely controls their own destiny. If they win out, they're making the playoff with that win against LSU on their resume. If they can win out and be the ACC champs undefeated with that win against LSU, I don't see anybody's resume knocking them out of the top 4. So I would need a loss from Florida State somewhere for Texas to jump ahead of them. So They definitely have the easier path in controlling their own destiny, but I just, and it's been a mistake I've had all year. I bet against them week one with LSU, and
I made that
it's
mistake too. I
I
ate
bet
the
against
LSU
them.
cheese.
I bet against them with Clemson, and they won that. Although that, I mean, that game was a debacle. Clemson was the much better team and threw that late pick six to blow the game, which was ridiculous. But so I've doubted Florida State all year, and they've proved me wrong all year. Betting against them again this week with UCF. Not that I think UCF's going to win the game, but plus 19. So they might just continue to prove me wrong. But and then once we get into the playoff national championship prediction, so my seeding, I actually had the seeding come out. I think Michigan would hop Georgia if Michigan goes undefeated. I think with wins over Ohio State and Penn State, I think their resume is actually better than what Georgia's would end up being.
Agreed.
So I went Michigan 1, Georgia 2, Washington 3, Texas 4. And then I actually have Texas upsetting Michigan in that matchup. We've seen Michigan do this 2 years in a row where they get to the college football playoff and then just kind of fall apart when they're facing non-Big Ten competition. I think their team is built perfectly for play in the Big Ten, and that's how they've beaten Ohio State the last 2 years is having that better style of physical Big Ten football, and then they get against a team that's just a lot more talented and things go wrong. And I think Texas would have a defense that could contain Michigan, and I think they would have the better quarterback. I like Ewers more than JJ McCarthy, and I think Texas would upset them. And this one more of a long shot, but just based on everything in my soul this year, I would have no choice but to pick another upset in Washington over Georgia. And then I would be taking Washington over Texas. It would be an insane national championship game, Washington, Texas. The total would be like 67-70, something ridiculous. We would see probably like a 45-38 national championship game. So as neutral fans, Washington, Texas would be way more exciting than Michigan, Georgia. I'll tell you that right now. And so that would be awesome to see. So I'm going Washington over Texas.
Yeah, I'm a little more boring. I have pretty chalky. I have Michigan, Georgia as the national title game. I have Michigan as the 1 seed because if they go undefeated, that they have 2 better wins than Georgia has 1 impressive win. And then the other game would be it would be Michigan, Florida State in the first round, and then Georgia, Washington in the other game. And then I would have Georgia winning, Michigan winning. And I think I really don't want to pick Georgia to win a 3rd chip in a row because that's boring. That's no fun. This is the least talented of the 3 Georgia teams, but like they kind of feel inevitable until Georgia starts messing up in those big spots again, like they did the previous like 4 years before they finally broke through. I'm kind of inclined to trust him. I'm inclined to trust Kirby because, like you mentioned, Harbaugh's come up short in these spots against the playoff teams. I mean, they sleptwalked through that first half against TCU last year. That was a winnable game. They had no business letting TCU even be in that game, let alone losing the game outright. I do agree with you that there is something there that kind of needs to be unpacked about Michigan, whether it's the coaching, the style of play, whatever, that just doesn't lend itself to playing as a favorite in the playoff.
Yeah. So one last crazy scenario that I want to talk about, and then we'll move on to this weekend's games. There has never been a college football playoff without an SEC team in it. We have had a lot of college football playoffs with 2 SEC teams in it. Is
Yeah.
there a chance if we have an undefeated Washington conference champion, an undefeated Florida State conference champion, an undefeated Michigan conference champion, and Georgia, Alabama? Alabama beats Georgia. So Alabama finishes 12-1, SEC conference champions. Texas beats Oklahoma. They're 12-1, Big 12 conference champions with a head-to-head win over Alabama. If they're both Power 5 conference champions with 1 loss and one of them beat the other, I don't see how you could justify putting Alabama in over Texas, which would leave the SEC out of this year's playoff.
I completely agree with you. We also know the committee has not been the most anti-SEC organization in existence. They have found ways to get a second SEC team in there, even probably when there were years they probably shouldn't have. I do think there's a world where, and I'll briefly mention this, there is a world where you get a configuration of the rest of the season playing out where I could see a second Big Ten team getting in based on who
Mhm.
beats who. I think that's the other kind of not likely, but possibility that's worth bringing up where if Michigan beats everybody else, but they lose to Penn State at Penn State, but Penn State loses to like Ohio State or something, there's a configuration where there's an argument for a one-loss team in the Big Ten making who wins the Big 12, excuse me, who wins the Big Ten title, getting in. There's a lot of permutation still to play out, especially because we don't know what's going to happen this weekend yet. After this weekend, then we can start, okay, we can rule out Ohio State or we can rule out Penn State as far as the CFP, unless someone else loses. And then we can start talking about multiple one-loss teams.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just something I was thinking about when I was putting my list together. I was like, I mean, like you said, they've found ways to be like, how can we get this 11-1 SEC team that didn't even make their conference championship game into the playoff? Where is now this, like we were saying, the gap between the top teams is less. It's the gap between the conferences has never been closer. The SEC, if you look at the SEC East, it's a joke. Tennessee's the second best team, and they're significantly worse than last year's Tennessee team. And you look at the SEC West, Ole Miss and LSU are the second and third best team and after Alabama probably, and both of them have like non-existent defenses that are just an absolute joke. So I think if there's any year that if you're like, I mean, I think Washington and Oregon could win the SEC. I think Texas could win the SEC. Like the Oklahoma, like these teams that in the past you're like, oh, if they got into the SEC, it'd be bad news, which is why the Pac-12 has been left out in the past. The ACC's been left out in the past, and it's just not the case this year. So it's going to be really interesting. And I feel like a lot of years you could say this halfway through the season, and then teams just start taking losses and things start to take shape a lot more clearly. But I don't think it's ever been this wide open. So I'm excited, but we can get into the Week 8 games now. There are 4 games that are ranked opponent against ranked opponent. So those are the 4 that I picked for us to go through. And we'll start with Ohio State, Penn State. It is by far the biggest game of the weekend. Both teams undefeated. The winner is in the best spot of any team in the Big Ten. You would have to say they're even in a better spot than Michigan because they've ticked off one of those 2 wins. Whereas Michigan will still have to play both of these teams that are the clear top 3 teams. And like we kind of glossed over it at the beginning, but we still don't really know who these teams are. Penn State on paper has maybe the best defense in the country by a lot of metrics. Their defensive metrics are at the top of basically every list. But when you look at their schedule, it's the best offense they've played is West Virginia, probably, which is like a middle of the road FBS offense. So they really haven't been tested, but on paper, we thought this defense was going to be really, really good, and they've lived up to everything and exceeded it. And then Ohio State, going into this year, the 2 questions were, could they make a jump on the defensive side of the ball, and is Kyle McCord going to be the guy? I think one of those questions has been answered. I think their defense, is it going to hold up against Penn State and Michigan? And if they make it to the playoff against one of these top teams, maybe not. But just from what we've seen, even against middle of the road competition or better competition in Notre Dame, their defense has clearly made a jump from where it's been the last couple of years. It's a much better defense. But Kyle McCord, I think that one is still up in the air. I don't think he's played in elite defense. The best defense they've played is Notre Dame, and he didn't look very good in that game against Notre Dame. They couldn't really move the ball that efficiently. They've basically had no run game too, which is very out of character for what we've seen from Ohio State the last couple of years. And offensively, I'm just not sold on them. And it's crazy, this game having a total of 46.5. When you look at the scores of Ohio State, Penn State the last couple of years, they turn into these crazy shootout. But I think if you look at last year's score, I'm going to pull it up really quick because when I was checking it, I forgot how ridiculous this game was. It was Ohio State was winning 16-14 going into the 4th quarter. and the final score was 44-31. The fourth quarter had 45 points in it between the two teams. So we've seen ridiculous games in this matchup in the past. But two completely different quarterbacks, two freshman quarterbacks, both of them, or not freshmen, but first year starting quarterbacks. And for both of them, this is going to be by far the biggest game they've ever played, especially for Drew Aller going on the road in this environment. It's going to be nuts. But where do you kind of see this game going in a different type of matchup than we've seen in the past?
Whenever we've done this preview episode for this game, I've brought up how both of these coaches forget how to coach. That is the biggest thing that comes up whenever these two teams play each other. Someone goes for a really weird fourth down way too early in the game on their own side of the field. Someone breaks out a fake punt. Somebody breaks out a double pass. There's always a weird play that ends up costing the team that runs it the game. And the last couple of years, that's been Penn State. Penn State has played Ohio State the closest of anybody other than Michigan, who's beaten them the last couple of years. And this is the first time in quite a while where I think the defenses are better than the offenses for both of these teams.
Mm-hmm.
Drew Aller hasn't been asked to do anything. They have had the training wheels on that offense the entire way. They have played bully ball against smaller teams. They've controlled the line of scrimmage. This is the first time in quite a few years Penn State actually has an offensive line that's going to not get the quarterback killed against Ohio State. That's been one of the telltale issues for Penn State the last couple of years, is that they just can't pass protect and give their quarterback enough time for plays to develop. They'll actually be able to do that this year. Ohio State's pass rush is good. In fact, they're a pass rush dependent defense. Their corners are a little bit, they're not liabilities, but they're not the typical Ohio State corners we've come to think about. Penn State's defense is great. They've got 5 guys who are going to get drafted this year. They've probably got 2 first-round picks on that defense. Both of the corners will likely play in the NFL eventually. They've probably got 2 NFL linebackers in the future. The talent is on the defensive side of the ball in this game, and both quarterbacks, McCord, the one good drive McCord had all season was the 2-minute against Notre Dame to get them down to the goal line, and they scored the touchdown against 10 guys. That's the best drive he's had all season. Drew Aller hasn't had to do that. The most stressful environment he's been in was when they were up like 4 at Northwestern on a noon kick in the noon kick Eastern time zone. So 11 o'clock Central. That was the closest game they've played pretty much all year. Was they were within a touchdown in Northwestern, and then they pulled away in the second half. But both of these offenses have started slow a lot this year, where it's taken quarter and a half to kind of get going. And against defenses this good, 46 is very low, but I see a world where this game is in the teens. I really do see a world where both quarterbacks just can't get anything going.
Yeah. And this, I think actually the last time I checked, I can look right now, the total is actually getting bet down even more. Yeah, it's 45.5 right now. So it's even going down a point from when I wrote this yesterday. Because I think it really is going to be, you're 100% right when you said both defenses are better than both offenses at this point. So I think the question mark, or the deciding factor in this game, is going to be which of the two young, inexperienced quarterbacks can make a big play, make the big throw downfield, and have one 50-yard touchdown pass that the other one doesn't, or one that makes the really bad mistake and throws the pick six, or throws an interception in the red zone when they're going down to get points. These points are going to be at such a premium that if somebody can score a defensive touchdown or a special teams touchdown, that is going to be massive and could be the thing that decides this game. And I think the one thing that we'll probably figure out pretty fast, unless, again, these coaches are crazy and maybe James Franklin is going to hold on to it as long as he can. But I think seeing whether Penn State opens up their playbook in this game offensively is, for me, a big question mark that I think we'll know pretty fast whether or not they're going to do that. Because like you said, Drew Aller has basically been asked to do nothing but be a game manager so far this season. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that when you have a young, inexperienced quarterback that you're just trying to get comfortable and get confident and get him in a place where he's feeling good about the offense, and you're playing inferior opponents and you just kind of want to grind games out and run the ball and play really good defense. He's done exactly what he's needed to do. But in this game, in the Michigan game, if they want to go even further and make it to the playoff, they're not going to be able to play that style. He's going to they can play that style to an extent, but they're going to have to open it up a bit, and he's going to have to make throws downfield if they want to beat teams like this. So I think seeing whether or not they're going to be willing to do that is going to be huge. And then the one other thing is just going to be if this Penn State defense is as good as we've seen, because like I said, they've been maybe the best in the country, but against really bad opponents, against Marvin Harrison Jr., are they going to be able to do that against this offense that we've seen at points be really, really good? I think Igbuka, I think, is still questionable. I don't think they know
Yeah.
if he's going to play. I think he probably doesn't play, which I think it really helps being able to put more focus on Marvin Harrison Jr. But I think it's going to be awesome. I think, like you said, I think it is going to be a low scoring, tough Big Ten type of game, which I think should be just as exciting as a shootout. And I'm going with, I bet Penn State plus 4.5. I really think this is like a field goal game either way. Um, I'm rooting for Penn State. I want them to win this game. I'm not going to be like throwing a big bet on the money line because I think it's going to be low scoring, close. Could come down to just a game winning field goal in either direction. But I really like the plus 4.5 with Penn State. I think it's going to be low scoring, and I think their defense is better than Ohio State's defense, and neither offense I'm totally sold on. So if I can get the better defense at plus 4.5, I'm taking it.
Completely agreed in every single respect there. The defenses being the deciding factors in this game, you take the better defense and you're getting points. I feel like value wise, you have to do that. And one last thing on the game, just as like big picture, this is the closest the quarterbacks have been in this game since I don't even know the last time they were this close. I mean, God bless Trace McSorley. He was very fun in college. He's not on the level of any of the Ohio State guys of the last couple of years. Same thing with Sean Clifford, Stroud, whether you're talking Stroud, House, Haskins, Fields, any of those guys. This is the closest talent-wise the quarterbacks have been. So to your point about Penn State needing Drew Aller to be able to make a play, they finally have a guy who can do that. That's kind of been one of the limiting factors Penn State's had as far as being a playoff team the last couple of years is they just don't have the quarterback talent. And when you don't have one of those 5 to 10 best quarterbacks in the entire country, you're very limited in your paths to victory. You're relying on your skill position guys, your defense, your special teams. Talent wise, Aller can sling it with the best of them. They haven't asked him to do that. They're second to last in explosive plays in the entire FBS. That goes to show you how little they've aired the ball out and how much it's been run the ball, play action, boot action underneath, and looking for yak plays that just haven't been there.
Yeah. And yeah, like I said, I think the big question is going to be whether that has been intentional to keep a lot of things in the playbook that Ohio State has not seen, and now it's time to go, or if for some reason the play callers don't trust him to make those throws, which hopefully they don't wait until they're down 14 and then go, okay, now air it out when Ohio State knows that they have no choice but to do it. So I hope we see a couple play action, deep shot early in the game type of plays, and because I think they could take advantage of Ohio State not being totally ready for that type of play calling. But moving on to the next game, it is Alabama Tennessee. This game was insane. Last year, Tennessee pulled off the upset over Alabama in this game last year. I think both of these teams are worse than they were last year, especially at quarterback. There's a lot of drop off to Jalen Milroe and Joe Milton. And it's a weird game. It's been a weird season for Alabama overall, where they lost the game to Texas in week 2, and it was like, oh man, that's when we were like, oh, Texas is for real. They really are all the way back. Alabama is, oh, it's like the Saban era over. They had that game against South Florida that they won, I think 17-3 final score against South Florida, where they benched Jalen Milroe, played 3 different quarterbacks that were all terrible. The next week brought Jalen Milroe back, then all of a sudden, the last couple of weeks, they've started to look a little more like Alabama. But then even last week against Arkansas, Milrow hits a big deep shot. Their defense looks really good. They're up like 23-3 at halftime or something. And then they just disappear in the second half and let Arkansas come all the way back into the game, almost blow it, and only win by 3. So they're just kind of all over the place. They've just been hard to kind of read week to week. And Tennessee's kind of been the same. Tennessee's defense is actually a little bit better than it was last year. They've been much better in the secondary, whereas last year you could just kind of take deep shots all day. We saw Spencer Rattler do it in that Tennessee game last year. You just could throw it over the top and anybody could just go up and get it and score touchdowns. And it was easy. It's not the same, again, looking at the total, 49.5, completely different than what we've seen from these teams the last couple years. Overall, I'm pretty confident in Alabama winning this game at home. I think they have the better, even though Tennessee has an improved defense, Alabama does have the better defense. I think their defense has been the bright spot for them this year, other than the Texas game. Their defense has actually been really strong. They totally shut down Ole Miss, who has lit it up against everybody else. And I just don't trust Joe Milton. I still don't. I haven't all year. And even though Tennessee's been decent, he still hasn't individually done that much for me to change his mind or change my mind about him. And against this defense, that'll be the best defense he's played all year in a really tough road environment. I just don't see it for Joe Milton. The only team that scored more than 21 points against Alabama this year is Texas. So they've held everybody to 21 or less. And I think there's no way they don't score more than 21 against this Tennessee team. So if you like their defense to hold up, I do think the number is kind of in a tough spot. If people want to buy Tennessee down, if it got to 7, is probably where I would play Alabama. I think where it's at right now, I'm not going to be playing the spread, but I do have Alabama in a money line parlay this week, actually with one of the games we're going to be talking about later. So I'm going to save that pick for the end. But I think Alabama wins the game. I think they probably end up winning it comfortably. But I think even they could win the game pretty comfortably, be up 14. Tennessee goes down and backdoors at the end and covers. So I'm not totally confident in the number, but I think Alabama wins.
I agree with you. I was going to say if I had to pick something, I would probably go with the over. This feels like 34-18, 34-17, something in that ballpark where it's close for maybe a half, and then Alabama really opens it up in the third quarter. And then, as you said, Tennessee gets that one last possession to come and make the score look a little more respectable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe one thing that I actually would do is if the game is kind of close at halftime is maybe get a live on Alabama. If you can get like better than -7, better than this pregame line if they're up 3, or if it's a tie game at halftime, as long as it hasn't looked totally weird, like they look totally off, then I think that could be a good play because I do think they would just be too much at the end of the day. The next game could be really good. It somewhat is dependent on health, and that's Florida State Duke. Florida State is a 14-point favorite, and it has moved from 14 yesterday when I wrote this to 13.5, which isn't a huge move, obviously, but maybe in a little bit in the right direction in terms of maybe what people are hearing about Riley Leonard. Obviously, got hurt against Notre Dame. They had the bye week, and then they played NC State last week, and he did not play in that game against NC State. The backup had, I want to get the numbers right, his numbers against NC State. To be fair, before I say the numbers, the game was pouring down rain for a lot of the game. And NC State also played terrible and just kind of gave the game to Duke. So they really didn't have to do much. But the backup, Henry Bellin, the fourth, was 4 of 12 passing last week against NC State. He actually had 107 yards, so 25 yards per completion, which is kind of ridiculous. But 4 of 12, only had 12 pass attempts, despite Duke's 24-3 win against NC State. Kind of ridiculous, but I don't think is going to give them enough offense to beat Florida State or maybe even hang with Florida State. I think it could be really tough for Duke if Riley Leonard is not back. If Riley Leonard is back, I think they could hang in this game. I think Florida State will probably win regardless, especially if Riley Leonard goes. He probably won't be at 100%. And he's so good at kind of scrambling and making plays with his legs. So if he's out, or even if he's hobbled, I think that's going to hurt them. But Florida State, like I said before, is just a team I'm not totally sold on. I still think LSU easily could have won that game. They made a couple terrible plays, that interception in the end zone early in the game. And we've seen LSU's defense since then. And so maybe what Florida State did against their defense is less impressive, that we've seen 5 other teams do that against their defense. And like I said, in the Clemson game, Clemson was the better team. Everything in the box score, Clemson was the better team and just kind of gave the game away. So 2 of their 6 wins, I think, easily could have gone the other way. And they've also just kind of been on cruise control since that win over Clemson. They've basically just been kind of rolling through inferior opponents, and now all of a sudden they're playing this Duke team that's one of the best coach teams in the country with Mike Elko. He is one of the best game planners, especially defensively, and their defense has been so good. They went into last week. NC State is not Florida State, but went into last week knowing they didn't have Riley Leonard, and their defense just dominated in every facet of the game, and they made it again. So their backup quarterback only had to attempt 12 passes because their defense just dominated. And I think he's going to drop some stuff that's really going to mess with Jordan Travis. And Jordan Travis didn't play very well in that Clemson game because that's what Clemson did. They drew up blitz schemes and coverage schemes that he looked kind of confused and made a couple really bad plays in that Clemson game. I think we could see that here. And so basically what this game comes down to for me is if Riley Leonard is playing, I think Duke covers this number and can take this game into the fourth quarter. And I think Florida State probably finds a way to win at home, but anything could happen. If Riley Leonard doesn't play, I see this game maybe staying close through the first half with Duke's defense making some big plays, and then maybe Mike Norvell makes the adjustments at halftime and they figure it out and kind of run away if Duke can't score. So really wait on the news of Riley Leonard. That's obviously not exciting to hear right now in terms of I'm telling you not to go place a bet right now, but wait on the Riley Leonard news. I think if they have him, they can hang. If they don't, they probably can't.
Yeah, I agree with you. 14 feels like a big number for Florida State because they haven't really played anybody decent in a while. And as you said, they've been kind of just beating up on bad teams. Duke will make this game competitive. Leonard playing or not really is kind of a deciding factor for me if I'm going to even touch this to begin with, because 14, you're just instinct. All right, Duke is not 14 points worse than Florida State, just in my head. But if your quarterback is dinged up, if you are going to be in a situation where your best player is dinged up, not at 100%, and do I really want to be sweating 14? Do I really want to be, if this game gets ugly, sitting there hoping that the injured guy is going to stay in the game long enough to kind of backdoor the game in?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just gonna have to wait on the injury news, and then I'll be tweeting out or in the Action app putting in whatever my bet's going to be on the game. Because I do like Duke in the spot. Maybe if Riley Leonard's not playing, an under wouldn't be a bad idea if you trust the Duke defense, but don't think that they'll be able to score. Or like I said, maybe a first half play on Duke to keep it close as long as they can with the defense. And but we'll see. Hopefully we get good news because I think this could be a great game if Riley Leonard can go. So hopefully he does. Then the last game we're going to talk about is USC Utah. USC is a 7-point favorite. The over/under is 56, and those numbers have not changed since yesterday. Still 7 and 56. USC had a horrific loss last week on the road against Notre Dame. It's hard to say it's a horrific loss when you're technically an underdog, but the way they played was just by far the worst Caleb Williams has ever played in his college career. Their defense was still as bad as their defense has been every other week this year. Their defense is just an absolute joke. But Caleb Williams looked so off. The play calling was super questionable. It looked like everybody, after the first pick six that Caleb Williams threw to start the game, it looked like almost everybody just kind of gave up after that. They were cold in that 50-degree weather in South Bend. They looked like they were freezing their asses off. It looked like nobody wanted to be there playing that game. Looked like they were like, this isn't even a conference game. We don't care. We're just going to quit. And it was a pretty pathetic performance by them. And then we have Utah, who has been one of the more bizarre teams kind of watched this year because of the Cam Rising saga, where we were talking in the summer about whether Cam Rising was going to be ready to go week one against Florida, and like, oh, the spread total, all this is going to depend on whether or not Cam Rising plays. He decided not to play in that week one game. And you're like, oh, that kind of makes sense. Non-conference game. They're probably not going to the national championship. Their goal is to win the Pac-12. So why would you risk bringing him back too early for a non-conference game? And then all of a sudden we did that week two against Baylor. He didn't play. We did that against UCLA. He didn't play. And all of a sudden we've been doing every week like, oh, he's got to be back this week. They had a bye. He still didn't come back after the bye last week against Cal. And I think that was for me, the nail in the coffin for Cam Rising. They had a bye. They were still sitting with only one loss, everything in front of them to win this conference. They play USC, they play Oregon, they play Washington. If they win out, they're going to the conference championship game. And they still decided not to bring him back. They still have not said anything more about him playing this week against USC. So I'm just going into each game assuming he's not playing. I think that's how you have to approach it from your picks, your bets that he's not going to be playing. And Kyle Whittingham is going to do this game for the rest of the season where he's like, I don't know, maybe this week. But I read something that it seems like he's not totally sold on his NFL future. He knows that this quarterback class is absolutely loaded, and he might take the medical red shirt this year and come back as like a 25-year-old next year and give it one more run at the Pac-12. So we'll see. So against backup quarterbacks, we'll see how this USC defense can maybe step up to the plate against not much of an offense. But what do you see in this game?
While you were talking about that, that reminded me of last year with JT Daniels in Georgia, where we spent the entire summer being like, if JT Daniels plays, Georgia's going to have a really good offense this year. And then he got in one game, he got injured, and then they spent the entirety of the rest of the season being like, he could play. He could play if we wanted him to. And then they just rode Stetson Bennett to the chip. As far as this game, Utah always wins with ugliness, physicality, things that USC doesn't like. USC does not like playing defense. They don't like being physical. And I want to take Utah +7. I really want to take Utah +7 because there's a world where you see the snowballing, where USC loses last week, they lose this week, and then at 2 losses, Caleb Williams is worried about the NFL, and he's not going to not play, but his head's not in it. And the team subsequently snowballs, and it gets away from them, and they finish with 3 or 4 losses. And you kind of look back at, damn, if they didn't shit the bed against Notre Dame, they could have had a really good season. But I want to take Utah +7. I really do.
You don't know if you can do it?
I don't know if I can do it just because Utah's offense terrifies me. And that's the thing. Like, are they going to be able to score 17, 20 points? I know USC's defense is horrendous. I know. Are they going to be able to get to that 20-ish point mark to keep it within 7? That's the only question I have.
Yeah. And so this was my going into the USC Notre Dame game. My question was, I know the USC defense is bad, but USC's offense, I just know they're going to get to this number. Like, even if you have a good defense, Notre Dame has a really good defense, Utah has a good defense. No matter how good your defense is, USC is going to get to at least whatever this number, 31 points or something. Like, they're going to hit that. And so you're going to have to keep up with that. But then last week against Notre Dame, Caleb Williams threw 3 interceptions, and that just didn't happen. They scored 20 points. And you're like, yeah, the USC's defense is terrible. Also, Sam Hartman threw for 126 yards. It's not like they were getting lit up all over the board. They basically just gave the game away. They turned the ball over. They couldn't keep the ball. And it was their offense that, I mean, the defense wasn't good. Whenever Notre Dame got the ball in short fields, they were able to run the ball down their throats basically and go score. So I'm not saying the USC defense was good because it wasn't, but the offense in Caleb Williams was by far the major problem in that game against Notre Dame. And at home in their comfortable environment, in the warm weather, even though Utah's defense is good, I do think this week USC is going to be able to get to that number, whatever you think it's going to be, 31 or 35. And so it's going to be, can Utah's offense kind of keep up with that number? And without Cam Rising, I just really don't think they can. If this game was on the road and they had to go to Utah, which is probably the hardest place to play in the country in my mind, with the elevation and the insane crowd there, it's easily top 5. I put it number 1. Just crazy voodoo happens there all the time. We saw USC go there and lose last season on the road. That was with Cam Rising playing, obviously, but Utah beat them in the regular season and in the Pac-12 championship game last year. So there is a big revenge factor. And so I think on 2 levels, if Caleb Williams has any kind of guts and like actually cares about winning at USC, like you said, there's a chance that he's just like, I think our season's probably over. I just saw how good Washington and Oregon are. We have to play both of those teams. We have a loss. I'm kind of checking out, and Lincoln Riley's kind of checking out. And there's always a chance that happens. But I think if they were to have any kind of like rallying anything between that embarrassing loss against Notre Dame, the fact that this is a team that beat them twice last season and took their conference championship and took their chance at going to the college football playoff last year, they probably would have gone if they would have won that game against Utah. I think they have to win this game. I don't fully trust the 7 points just because, like you said, Utah can just muck it up and make it weird and ugly. But I just find it hard to believe that. I don't think Utah could blow them out like Notre Dame did last week, just because Caleb Williams isn't going to play that bad again. Even if he doesn't care, he's not going to play that bad again. And Utah's offense just isn't going to be able to do even what Notre Dame's offense could do. So I think if anything, it's going to be close down the stretch. And I think if you give Caleb Williams the ball at home and he has a chance to go win the game, I just think he does. So I was talking about it earlier with Alabama. I bet in Alabama, it's really an Alabama USC money line parlay, but then I also threw in North Carolina, who has a home game against UVA that they're like 23-point favorites in, and that just kind of brought it down from like minus 125 down to minus 109 by throwing UNC in there. So you don't have to, but there's just no way they lose that game, and that makes it a little better. So I think USC and Alabama both win those games. So that's how I'm approaching those two is throwing them into that money line parlay together.
I think I'm probably going to end up betting Utah. I'm probably not going to be around the TV after the Penn State game ends for most of my Saturday. So I will be doing the very infrequent updates of scrolling the ESPN app, refreshing, checking the scores, and then hoping I have money for Sunday.
Yeah. All right. So that's what we're going with. This was a great episode, as always. Thanks for coming on. We always have a good time, and I'm sure maybe for Penn State, Michigan, or hopefully Penn State has even bigger games down the line, or even if Penn State's not in it, love to have you on again later in the season. Do you want to let people know where they can follow you and listen to your shows?
Sure. My Twitter handle is Nick Zararis, Nick Zararis. I do Liberty Blue Pod, which is Rangers. I do MYG Weekly, which is Giants football. I do Locked On Flames, which is the Calgary Flames. I edit for the Jetstream. I do a ton of content. Twitter's the easiest place because all of my stuff is kind of aggregated there.
Yeah, you can find it all there. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe. That'd be awesome. Like the video, that'd be awesome. Wherever you're listening to this in audio, subscribe there, all that stuff. is very appreciated. And yeah, thanks again, Nick, and see you guys next time.